At UFC 224, bantamweight champion Amanda Nunes defeated title challenger Raquel Pennington via TKO in round 5. Everybody's talking today about what happened in between rounds 4 and 5 in the corner of Raquel Pennington. Basically, Raquel told her cornermen and her coaches that she was done and wanted to be out of the fight. But as you can see from the clip, and as evidenced by the fact that the fight went on to the 5th round, her coaches didn't listen and they put her back in there, and obviously we all know what happened, right? She basically just took more damage unnecessarily, and for obvious reasons a lot of people are upset. It's causing a lot of controversy and conversation about coaches' responsibilities to their fighters, about safety and consent. And I think that this is the perfect opportunity to really start a conversation about consent and fighting, which is not something that we maybe talk a lot about, and probably because, well, it's fighting. So it's pretty clear in terms of what you're getting yourself into, the risks that come with the sport, the levels of damage that you take. It's something that is no mystery, it's no surprise, it's not something that's hidden, and it's something that most fighters will also experience in their training leading up to fights. So for the most part, you don't see things like this happen very often, where somebody will declare themselves as being done, or will be sort of asking for a way out of the fight consciously. Usually what happens if a fight doesn't go to decision is either somebody is deemed unable to continue the contest by the referee, although cornermen can actually quote unquote throw in the towel for their fighters, and can deem their fighter unfit to continue, and stop the fight that way. But pretty much it's usually left up to the referee's discretion, which can be good or bad depending on the circumstances, because usually quitting is synonymous with being submitted, and saying you got me, right? And so typically that's done with some kind of a tap. And usually that happens when there's some kind of a hold, or a fighter is in a position that they essentially aren't going to be able to get out of, or from their own sort of intelligence or wherewithal, don't think that they're going to be able to escape from. It makes sense, because when someone has you in some kind of a choke, and you can't get out of it, there's really only two options, right? You're either gonna go out and go unconscious, and depending on it, if it's an air choke or a blood choke, either your air flow is gonna get cut off and you're not gonna be able to breathe, or the blood flow is gonna stop going to your brain, and so you're gonna go unconscious that way. And that happens usually somewhere between like 10 and 15 seconds of being fully in a choke. Or you can decide that you don't want to fully go unconscious and have the ability to think and reason that, if you stay in this position, that is what's going to happen, and you're not going to be able to get out of it. So you decide to quit. But there's definitely still a lot of nuance here, and a lot of really interesting power dynamics, I think, that are going on with all of these sort of options for ending a fight, let's say. Because although most fights that end via submission do end in a tap out, and it's not really looked at as being weak or anything negative in terms of a connotation on the fighters, if they decide to tap out when they're put into a submission, there's a certain stigma for kind of deciding to end a fight or to quit, and a thought process that means that you're psychologically or mentally weak, since you're taking yourself out of the contest before the contest is being taken away from you by someone else, like a referee or a corner. Because obviously there are exceptions, like last night, and I think one of the most obvious ones is tapping due to strikes, because even though most of the time people don't tap unless they're in a submission, you can actually tap out if you want to quit for any reason. And especially if you're in a position where you're taking a lot of physical damage, a lot of times you'll see this happen when someone's in full mount and is just raining down punches and elbows onto someone, and there's just nothing that they can do about it, or they don't think they can do about it. But if they don't think they can do it, they're not going to be able to do it, since everything ultimately comes from the mind and stems from the mental aspect, because you have to be able to think it in order to actually do it. Anyway.
Yeah, and Neil Hall saying he did it twice there, so
yeah, once
certainly a justified point deduction. But Robinson is fit to continue, but he now has to start back on his feet, which is where Duke is at home, and Duke throws a nice front kick. Oh, the flying knee, but Robinson's caught him, and Robinson with some huge shots, and this one's all over!
Because of that, there's a certain thought process and logic that if you decide to quit, that means that you're not sort of riding out your full physical potential, and it indicates some kind of a mental weakness or hole in your game in terms of your mindset. Because a quitter is not somebody that is a real fighter, in the sense of you're not fighting because you're deciding to take yourself out of the fight. So what does that have to say about you in terms of your sort of stance or your position within MMA, right? And I think it's definitely a valid question, and it's a really interesting phenomenon. Fighters also are people that are incredibly self-confident and self-assured. It's kind of impossible to be in a fight if you don't think that you're going to win it, or if you're not confident in your skills, because quitting means that you're not actually fighting. And if you're not fighting until like the death, basically, there's a question of if you're really a fighter. And that's not coming from me necessarily, that's I think just coming from the general sort of MMA zeitgeist, if you will. Now, what happened last night with Raquel was interesting in that she decided that she wanted to quit. She wanted out, and she said that, I want out. She just didn't want to continue the fight, and her corner told her to change her mindset and to just throw everything that she had in Amanda in the 5th round. And most people were outraged by this and thought that her cornermen and her coaches did her wrong and made an incredibly selfish call by putting her back in there after she clearly stated that she didn't want the fight to continue. Going back to the original point, that this raises a really interesting question about consent, because if she had gone to the referee and said that she wanted out, the fight would have been stopped. She didn't choose to do that. Instead, she chose to go to her coaches, and whether that was a conscious decision or not is not something that we obviously know, right? And, perhaps she thought her coaches would have a different response, perhaps not. It's very hard to say also without knowing their coach and fighter relationship. But it's interesting how there's all these kind of nuances and ways of both consenting and taking away your consent to being in a fight, because there's really kind of limited options in terms of what you can do if you want out. Now, it's still, I think, a pretty low barrier to entry to get out of a fight if you don't want to be in it anymore, because as stated before, you can tell the referee that you're done, you can tap out, you can talk to your coaches and have them stop the fight. There's a lot of ways that you can consciously get out of a fight, but at the same time, sometimes there's actually limited opportunity to exercise. You're striking with someone on the feet, but you want out of the fight. It's going to be very difficult to tap out when you're on the feet. That's not something you really even ever see happen. It's probably not going to be very easy to approach the referee in the middle of the round. You're probably going to have to wait till the round's over and all that stuff, right? So it's not something that seems like an option at every single second of the fight. And, you know, there's the questions also around other people taking away your ability to fight, right? So the referee being able to determine if you're not able to intelligently defend yourself, or if you're not intelligently defending yourself, that's the barrier that's used to determine if a fight needs to be stopped. And if coaches decide to throw in the towel for you, they can actually decide if the fight's going to continue for you. And part of the responsibility of coaching, as it's sort of seen and understood in modern day MMA, is that their job is to protect their fighter. And if their fighter is being put into harm's way and into danger that they aren't able to defend, and the corner sees this, and they want to protect their fighter from themselves, basically, them ending the fight for them and making that call is essentially that happening, is a form of protection. But it's interesting in that there are so many ways that fights can end that don't come by your way of consent, because you can't consent anymore according to the way that fights are constructed. Many ways that a fight can end on your own consent, but still there's it's not 100% available in all positions, let's say, or in a way that's very clear cut and concise, as evidenced by the previous example of, you know, being on the feet in the middle of a round. Some of these things are points of discussion that should be had in the broader MMA community, just because consent is the biggest part of anything, and especially when you're talking about a fight, you know, you have to have the consent of the fighters, and really even the corners and the referee, everybody involved, for a fight to happen or to continue. A lot of times these things are taken for granted, and then when things happen like last night where somebody wants out but they're not given the out that they want, and then as a result they end up taking more damage, and the fight's ended anyway, it's a huge problem. A fighter's choice and decision wasn't respected, and as a result they took more damage and were not protected, you know, by the people that are supposed to be protecting them, as we understand the roles of coaches. This is something that needs to be talked about a little bit more so that we can avoid situations like that, because fighters should be able to decide to quit if that's what they feel is best for whatever reason. And I think the stigma around exercising that right is going away and is not nearly what it used to be, but I think some of it's carried over in that, you know, there's not all of these clear-cut avenues that somebody has to quit. As mentioned, there's a lot of barriers to entry, and there probably should be a little bit more of a clear-cut system that is just more functional, because having to go to your coaches and then having your coaches go to the referee or the doctors or whoever it is, obviously, like, it involves middlemen, right? Like, the coaches are the middlemen. And should that even be something that's happening? Because as evidenced by last night, the coaches can almost sort of overrule the fighter too. If the fighter doesn't go to the referee, or you know, doesn't make any other sort of move, and, you know, the corner keeps them in the fight, you know, should they have that power? Why do they have the power to overrule their fighter in terms of staying in the fight? I think it makes sense in terms of getting them out of the fight, but maybe that's something also that should be examined, right? Like, if they throw in the towel, you know, they can do that without their fighter's consent. And by the same token, if the fighter wants to quit, the corner can keep them in the fight, in the sense of them saying they want to quit isn't enough to actually stop the fight. The fighter would have to go to the referee then and say that. But it's an inefficient system, right? Like, by design. So yeah, so I think that's something interesting that kind of came up for me in terms of thinking about consent and fighting, and all the nuances that are there and maybe shouldn't be. So I would love to hear what your thoughts are, and, you know, what you think could be done about this, or to avoid situations like this happening in the future, where this kind of ambiguity ends up causing problems and unfortunately results in the fighter's wishes not being respected. So thank you all so much for watching, and make sure to subscribe for more videos, and I'll see you soon.